Hey everyone, it's been a while. In between the Heavensward video and the Heavensward Patch Quest video, I've had this idea floating around in my head for a little bit, going on and off on whether it was even worth talking about the subject to begin with. I don't know, I guess I finally put my foot down on the idea. As even casual Final Fantasy XIV fans know, 2024 was the dawn of, well, Dawntrail, the newest expansion pack in a long lineage of some of Square Enix's most acclaimed work. Dawntrail would hit the market on July 2nd of 2024, to mostly positive reviews, all things considered, from both critics and Final Fantasy XIV players. Don't get me wrong, I'm not naive. I've seen the memes about the return of Stormblood discourse. I'm aware that Dawntrail has hiked a little bit of controversy and polarization since its release. That being said, it would be folly of me not to recognize that it is generally well liked, despite whatever flaws it may have, and despite comparisons to Shadowbringers and Endwalker. But the release of Dawntrail wasn't just new content. In fact, it brought along some significant new changes alongside it. Most notably, director and producer Naoki Yoshida and his team at Square had been teasing a next-generation graphical update for a while now, showing off things like preliminary art tests and the like over the years. Now, Final Fantasy XIV, in its current incarnation, is a game that is over a decade old, and while I personally thought it looked pretty damn good, context considered, it is important to recognize that it has aged. Now, I think there's a lot of positives to a game looking its era. It's an interesting historical artifact. It represents aesthetic and technological choices that may be less common, if not downright extinct nowadays, and it provides an interesting aesthetic to new generations who are used to different aesthetics. That being said, Final Fantasy XIV is a little bit different. There are a few reasons why Square might want to upgrade the game's graphical presentation. Being a live service game, it's constantly attracting new players, and some of the more persnickety types may be turned off by the game's admittedly dated early 2010s presentation. Not to mention, perhaps more importantly, a dated game engine limits what Square's impeccable art team is able to accomplish. Finally, the game in its at-the-time current state still suffered from some graphical flaws and technical issues that definitely should have been fixed. Needless to say, although I'm certainly going to miss the game's older presentation, an update does make sense. Now, to my understanding, the graphical updates Final Fantasy XIV is receiving have not been finished yet, and Square intends to do more. While I don't doubt this for even a second, I kinda got tired of waiting and wanted to get into some of the really nitty-gritty nerd stuff. I've kept you waiting long enough with my ranting though, and I feel some important disclaimers are warranted. I am viewing this from the perspective of a PC gamer. If you are playing on PlayStation, Xbox, or even Mac OS, you might have a different experience than I did. Not to mention, this graphical update was primarily made to show off Dawntrail, and I am very far from getting there. I'm aware that the best of the best here will be seen in Dawntrail, but I didn't want to keep ignoring this update in future videos, so consider this more of a general overview of what they've done here. While I won't be discussing narrative in this video, there may be minor visual spoilers if you haven't completed A Realm Reborn or Heavensward, though they'll largely be out of context and likely won't ruin anyone's experience. In my opinion, you should be fine, but if that's a concern to you, then you've been warned. Finally, I am going to try to get very technical with this video. While I'll try my hardest to explain terminology and technology as much as I can, I'm not an expert, just a dorky college student with a hyperfixation, so apologies if my explanations may be insufficient. I also want to recognize the limits of my own hardware. Although I have a very good PC, certainly well enough to run this game very well, there are some things I just cannot check. I don't have an ultra-wide monitor, for example, so I can't check this game's ultra-wide support. That's just one example though. With that being said, let's just dive right in. The first thing I'd like to look at is the features in the game's options menu. Firstly, anti-aliasing, where Square has substantially expanded our options here. I'd like to go out of my way to praise Square for allowing the player to entirely disable anti-aliasing if they so please. A lot of modern games do not allow you to disable it whatsoever, usually forcing some manner of TAA. While I personally prefer something to nothing, I think giving players the option is something to be praised, if you're the type to like pixels so sharp they can cut your arm off. Of course, NVIDIA's Fast Approximate Anti-Aliasing, or FFXIV, the game previously had, is still an option here. FFXIV is a form of what we call post-processed anti-aliasing that smooths the image as it appears as pixels. This means that, unlike methods such as MSAA, which analyze the individual model geometry of the game's environments, FFXIV does not analyze the game's geometry in any way, simply the pixels that appear on the screen. The benefit of this is that FFXIV is pretty light in terms of hardware requirements, meaning that those with lower-end PCs can still see improvements in image quality. However, image quality itself is the trade-off. In comparison to none at all, of course, I'd say it's an improvement, but FFXIV is notorious for being a very bare-bones implementation of anti-aliasing, and Final Fantasy XIV is no exception to this rule. For example, let's take a look at Capcom's Resident Evil HD Remaster, and look at how jagged it still looks even on the maximum FFXIV setting. This is a game that, as beautiful as it is, never exactly achieves clean image quality due to Capcom's FFXIV implementation. As far as Final Fantasy XIV goes, while it should look okay enough in still scenes, move around, especially in grassy areas such as the Hawthorne Hut, and it becomes a shimmering mess, just slightly blurrier than before. While the generally softer appearance of this update should alleviate this slightly compared to the original graphical presentation, it's still far from ideal. It's a fairly low quality option, and really only should be used if you have a lower end PC to the extent where the other options would cause performance issues where FFXIV would not. Our next option is Intel's temporally stable conservative morphological anti-aliasing, or TSCMAA. Now, CMAA is not a new technique. It's been around for a while and can be seen in games such as Blizzard's World of Warcraft. Essentially, what CMAA intends to do is provide better image quality than FFXIV while only being slightly more demanding, once again giving more avenues to those with lower-end PCs. TSCMAA, then, is Intel's new enhanced version of CMAA. Essentially, the difference is that in order to prevent shimmering, TSCMAA applies temporal anti-aliasing, a modern and extremely common technique, to the image during movement. In direct still comparisons, TSCMAA does look better and sharper than FFXIV, but the problem comes during said movement. The image quality disparity between still scenes and moving scenes is very apparent, with the image suddenly blurring the moment you decide to take a stroll. Now, sometimes this doesn't look too bad. Take a stroll down Limsa Lominsa's lower decks, and the stone walkways beneath your feet don't look so bad and resolve well enough. Take a stroll through any grassy area, though, and the blurring looks jarring and strange, as if the plants around you are just clamming up for the winter season. So, it is an improvement, but it's not without flaws. One may wonder then, why are there two TSCMAA options? The second option is TSCMAA plus camera jitter, which essentially implies the temporal pass to the entire screen, not just on moving pixels. This looks significantly better in my opinion, and properly smooths out the game's shimmery appearance. If you take a look here, you can see that the grass blades behind me look far smoother and way less jaggy, which none of the other prior methods had been able to achieve. There is still a minor discrepancy in blur during movement, but it's far less noticeable, and I feel like only the more eagle-eyed will know or care. Personally, I still consider this to be a bit of an issue, as I happen to be one of those people, but most people likely won't, and that's perfectly fine. There is still some shimmer, but it's far less noticeable, especially on larger displays. Now, of course, the trade-off here is that the game still has a relatively blurry appearance, as temporal anti-aliasing tends to do, but also that it introduces, well, jittering in areas that had previously not existed. So essentially, it cleans up shimmering, but introduces jittering in other areas. Personally, I think TSCMAA with camera jitter is better than TSCMAA without, as the blur discrepancy is very distracting for me, but those who are very distracted by camera jitter will probably do well to just enable the default version instead. There is one more traditional anti-aliasing option available to us, NVIDIA's Deep Learning Anti-Aliasing, a brand new technique that uses their DLSS upscaling solution but applied to natively rendered frames. Instead of upscaling from a lower resolution to a higher one, DLAA takes a native resolution image and attempts to behave more like native anti-aliasing. As far as Final Fantasy XIV's options go, this is easily my preference. It is the perfect combination of sharp and stable. You get a very clean, clear image here, and when moving around, everything is perfectly stable, at least compared to the other methods. There's hardly any shimmering to speak of, and the image maintains a fairly consistent quality no matter what's going on. Before the update, a place like Gridania would look like a shimmery mess, but now you finally get to appreciate how nice Square Enix's environmental design looks, and how much the foliage assets actually add to the environmental art. By far, this is the one I recommend. Although the TSCMAA options are not bad, DLAA basically blows it out of the water in terms of both image quality and stability. However, it's important to note that DLAA, for whatever reason, is not a standalone option. You can only enable it by selecting DLSS and setting the frame rate threshold to either below 30 frames per second or below 60 frames per second. Seeing as my PC is well above the recommended specs for this game, setting it to either one of these options is essentially enabling DLAA, as my frame rate will essentially never drop that low. I don't like this though. I think this sucks because it essentially just confuses people. Something that PC games have been criticized for in the past is the absolute wealth of options, but no explanation as to what they actually do. While this problem has vastly improved over the years, with most AAA developers giving you image examples and text explanations as to what each option does, Square's DLAA implementation here, and frankly their implementation of anti-aliasing in general, doesn't exactly explain things much for the average person who may be looking to get a pretty experience but doesn't exactly know the difference between TSCMAA or DLAA, especially when DLAA isn't really a dedicated option. Some people may not even be aware the game supports DLAA, and may just think their only option is DLSS, and stick to a lower quality implementation such as TSCMAA when they could be experiencing far better. It's also important to note that DLAA, like DLSS before it, is exclusive to NVIDIA's graphics cards. So if you play on an AMD or Intel video card, both of those options will be entirely unavailable to you. However, this is not Square's fault, rather NVIDIA's, and it's a restriction they've been criticized for years at this point, and a criticism I wholeheartedly agree with. Although Square can't really do anything about it, it's still important for you, the viewer, to know. So if you play on a video card that isn't NVIDIA, TSCMAA plus camera jitter is ultimately my recommendation. But that's not where the options end. Especially important for mid to low end PCs, Square has introduced high fidelity upscaling to the game in the form of a couple of options. Now, what is high fidelity upscaling? You've probably heard it under more branded terms, such as DLSS or FSR. Now, what high fidelity upscaling does is render the image at a lower internal resolution than the option selected before upscaling with advanced deep learning algorithms into an image quality that should roughly resemble the native resolution you chose. For example, a game could render internally at 480p and use an upscaling technique to scale the game to 4K in order to save on performance. Now, of course, the quality of this depends heavily on what the internal rendering resolution is. 1080p upscaled to 4K will look much better than 480p upscaled to 4K, which is generally why they provide you with numerous options. As video games continuously get more and more demanding, as is the natural order of things, upscaling is a very handy tool and has benefited many games in the past, though these implementations are not created equal. Some games, such as Capcom's Resident Evil Village, look downright ugly with upscaling enabled, forcing those who care about image quality to stick to more demanding native resolutions, and it's a huge shame for a very good game with an otherwise stellar graphical presentation to suffer from such a crippling flaw. So where does Final Fantasy XIV stand on this chart? Our first option is NVIDIA's Deep Learning Super Sampling 3.5, or DLSS. However, Final Fantasy XIV's DLSS implementation is a bit of an odd one, something we've discussed a little bit before with its DLAA implementation. Most games give you options as to how you'd like to configure DLSS. For example, playing on the Ultra Performance setting will set the internal resolution to something extremely low, whereas playing on the quality setting will set it relatively high, with the former aiming to enhance performance and the latter image quality. Final Fantasy XIV has no such options. Instead, DLSS is treated more as a dynamic resolution option. Like I said earlier, the game has options to switch from DLAA to DLSS once performance hits a certain negative threshold. I can't demonstrate this here, as the game runs way too high on my PC to be able to, but the general idea is that if you struggle with performance issues on other options, the game will utilize DLSS as a form of dynamic resolution, keeping your game at a minimum frame rate of either 30 or 60 frames per second, depending on what option you choose. This is a nifty option, and one that is fantastic for those with lower-end PCs, but it does mean that for those who desire a set, consistent preset, such as myself, you're kind of stuck with just one option, being the always enabled preset. Now, as I said, this is fantastic for lower-end PCs, but for those who desire to squeeze more performance out of the game, but don't necessarily need DLSS to play comfortably, this option is bizarre. For example, I have a high-end PC, and a potential use case of DLSS here would be to have the game run better while still looking rather good. Sure, there are visual trade-offs, but it wouldn't have been a bad option at all, and might have even been my preference. However, the always enabled preset is always dynamic. As a result, you can see scenes that go from tack sharp to incredibly blurry at the drop of a hat. At one point during my testing, the game locked at an internal resolution of 720p for some reason, which is generally used for the performance modes in other games, and never moved, which ended up looking very bad, just an absolutely smeary mess that caused me to immediately disable this option. In fact, while re-recording footage for this video, I came to the realization that the game's DLSS dynamic resolution essentially just lowers when you move at all. It's relatively stable when you keep the camera still, but when you play the game as usual, in my experience, the resolution would just continue to drop until it stayed locked at 720p permanently, with the only exception being the game's photo mode, where it enables DLAA instead for understandable reasons. This mode seems essentially broken to me and is completely useless from any sort of high-end PC gaming perspective. Now, of course, this is still a great option for those who really need those extra frames, which is seemingly what Square intended it for, but if you can spare a few, I would stick exclusively to DLAA. I simply just don't think that DLSS is worth bothering with until Square greatly expands its functionality for this game. In this comparison, the choice is obvious. Once again, DLSS is exclusive to Nvidia cards, so if you play with an AMD or Intel card, this option would be entirely unavailable for you. Our final upscaling option here is AMD's Fidelity FX Super Resolution 1, or FSR. However, this option is far simpler than Nvidia's offering. As said prior, Square's implementation of FSR here is mostly just as a dynamic resolution option. Unlike DLSS though, you can actually use this in combination with the game's native anti-aliasing options, or none at all if you'd prefer. This results in a game that looks very chunky though, especially in motion. You can alleviate this by enabling anti-aliasing alongside it, but as you might imagine, it looks vastly worse than native resolutions. But I imagine those yearning for better performance aren't exactly reaching for TSCMAA, so to some extent this is understandable. Once again, the end result is far chunkier and features a lot more shimmering, though as I just said, I feel those enabling this for performance gains won't really care. Like DLSS, however, there are no traditional quality options here, unlike other FSR-enabled games, and this is strictly for lower-end systems or for those who won't care about image quality. I set up a makeshift benchmark scenario using 3 categories: DLAA at native 1440p, DLSS enabled, and FSR with TSCMAA plus camera jitter. In this scenario, I walk around a certain path at the Hawthorne Hut, and I tried to keep as many variables consistent as possible. Weirdly enough, in my testing, the time of day did not seem to affect performance at all. I also turned off LOD scaling to properly stress test the game. The graphics settings are otherwise at their maximum settings. An important note is that during my anecdotal gameplay, in which I use DLAA, the game ranges anywhere from a very playable 80 to 120 frames per second. With DLAA at native 1440p, the game runs at a consistent 55 frames per second in my testing. While not unplayable, especially due to its consistency, it is a good illustration of how demanding native resolutions can be in certain scenarios. With DLSS here, the game runs around, though is not locked, at 82 frames per second, which is around a 49% increase in performance. A rather large, if not massive jump, all things considered. Taking a look at FSR, we get fairly similar performance across the board, but it's slightly less consistent than DLSS, dipping into the high 70s rather frequently. However, I would personally argue that FSR, despite its visual flaws, actually looks better than DLSS in this implementation, as it is seemingly not broken and functioning properly, unlike its Nvidia counterpart. Therefore, if I had to use one or the other, I would personally argue for FSR, as despite the slightly less consistent performance, it makes up for it with better, albeit still imperfect, image quality. Though it is to be said that, while Team Red is my personal winner in this competition, Team Green technically still does have more consistent performance, so that is something to consider when making a decision. Interestingly, for shits and giggles, I used FSR with no anti-aliasing and the render scale set to 50% to see how it would perform, and the answer was surprising. it actually doesn't perform much better than my previous readings, despite the huge cuts to resolution and visual quality, which I do think illustrates Final Fantasy XIV's general struggles with optimization. It's an issue I feel the game has always had, and while the problem has improved for me over time due to the purchasing of better hardware, I never feel it performs appropriately, given its graphical presentation's very attractive yet still decidedly 7th gen roots. Though of course, I recognize the struggles of optimizing MMOs, what with hundreds if not more players all existing on the game's server at once. To my understanding, this is not a problem any major MMO developer has been able to solve consistently, and the answer as of now, at least for this game, seems to be to just brute force it with additional power or adjust your graphical settings as needed. Finally, for the curious, here's a demonstration of DLAA, DLSS, and FSR all being compared at once. Keep in mind, this is a huge game, and I couldn't test this in every single area, so it really depends on where you are in the game and what hardware configuration you have, so you will see variance here. Ultimately, if you have the hardware capabilities, my recommendation would be to play with DLAA. It simply looks the best to my eyes, with the sharpest image and best stability, blowing the other anti-aliasing options out of the water. If you don't have an NVIDIA card, I would recommend TSCMAA plus camera jitter, which while flawed in its own ways, is ultimately my preference when it comes to image quality, assuming we ignore DLAA. Ultimately though, this does all come down to preference, and that's why these options exist. You pick the one that looks the best to your eyes, which is why you can even play without anti-aliasing if you'd like. Now, there are still other options. There are programs out there that can force techniques such as SMAA into 3D programs such as Final Fantasy XIV, and there's even a mod out there that enables the use of FSR2, 3, and Intel's XE supersampling, and can even restore the default scaling options for DLSS. Now, I would love to show you how that works, but Square's don't ask, don't tell policy with mods means that I really don't want to risk getting my account banned, so I can't tell you if that mod is any good or how to use it, merely the fact that it exists and to use it at your own risk. The next thing I'd like to show off are the improvements to the game's ambient occlusion option. Now, what is ambient occlusion? Ambient occlusion is a form of lighting calculation meant to essentially mimic how exposed certain points in a scene are to ambient light. For example, in this shot here, we can see that the Ishgardian sunlight will hit the top and sides of these boxes and sandbags, but the areas that would be less exposed to sunlight are occluded with shading, such as the area between the boxes and the floor, and the contact points between the sandbags. As we can see here, disabling ambient occlusion entirely results in an image that looks rather flat and unrealistic in comparison. Previously, Square gave you 5 options when it comes to ambient occlusion: off, light, strong, HBAO plus standard, and HBAO plus quality. Now, my preference beforehand was always squarely HBAO plus quality, as the normal options barely affect the scene, with only HBAO plus providing any real ambient occlusion. Now, NVIDIA's Horizon-based ambient occlusion plus is a very good method here, obviously adding greatly to the realism of the scene. However, this new update gives us 2 new options in the form of ground truth ambient occlusion, with both a standard and quality option. Essentially, what HBAO intends to do is to essentially compute the non-occluded region based on the maximum horizon angle at which light can actually get the light. In more simple terms, the maximum horizon angle itself determines how the ambient occlusion is rendered. GTAO is similar to HBAO in the sense that it is also calculated based on the maximum horizon. However, it is often said to be both more efficient and more advanced without sacrificing quality. Essentially, the difference between GTAO and HBAO is that GTAO reformulates the reference frame on which the horizons are computed, and therefore the integration domain. I'm having difficulty boiling that down to a more understandable sentence for those not in the know, but what this essentially means is that it's a similar yet different method that in this specific instance provides better results. While HBAO Plus was a pretty good implementation, GTAO is obviously better in my opinion. As you can see here with HBAO Plus, the space between the smaller box and the larger box is unshaded in a way that feels unrealistic. GTAO instead shades in this area, leading the scene a much greater depth and realism. However, this comparison is between the two quality options. You might see here that comparing GTAO standard versus quality, this shading is only present in the quality option. So to some, HBAO Plus on the quality setting may be considered preferable to GTAO on the standard setting, as HBAO Plus quality is more pronounced. However, if we were to compare HBAO Plus and GTAO with both on the standard setting, you might see that the box here almost appears to float above the ground in HBAO Plus standard, whereas it looks much more realistic in GTAO standard. Ultimately, if performance is of no concern to you, then GTAO quality is the obvious choice here. Compared to HBAO Plus or any of the lesser options, GTAO quality provides a much more realistic image and makes Final Fantasy XIV's gorgeous locations have much more depth to their geometry. That being said, there is a bit of a long-standing issue this game has with ambient occlusion. Since the game's ambient occlusion implementation, no matter the setting, is always screen space oriented, or in layman's terms, only actually renders with the pixels available on screen as opposed to anything to do with the model geometry themselves, there are many moments where the game's ambient occlusion can warp and shift in ways based on how the camera is positioned and the actions in the scenes. This can happen both while just playing the game normally and even during cutscenes. While this is sort of an inevitability with any form of screen-based effects system whatsoever, this is rather pronounced in certain scenes and can be a little distracting, especially during cutscenes when it does happen, which is especially a scenario where you don't want the player's attention diverted elsewhere. That being said, it isn't the biggest issue in the world. However, I also can't really see a solution without going full ray-traced ambient occlusion, and I'm really not sure if that's possible in such an old engine at this point. I'm simply pointing it out because, inevitable or not, it is still a visual anomaly that does negatively affect the experience to some degree. Another option I'd highly recommend turning on is a brand new one, the ability to enable dynamic grass interaction. Previously, foliage was rather static, and while it did appear to sway in the wind, your character's movements had no impact on it at all. What this option does is exactly what it says on the tin, and Square has even gone out of their way to remake the grass textures in order to accommodate for this. Foliage now moves when you stomp through it, a relatively minor feature to be sure, but one that greatly enhances my immersion in the game. I'm a bit of a weird player, and I always like to imagine the senses my character is feeling in video games, such as the temperature, the smells, the sounds, the physical feelings that the character must be experiencing while playing the game. And previously, the grass parting at my feet was something I'd only have to imagine in Final Fantasy XIV, but no longer. Now I can see it doing that, which is pretty cool. Is it minor? Sure, but it's an appreciated one nonetheless. I'd also like to take a look at how the game's shadows have improved, starting with shadow softening. Previously, you had two options, weak and strong. Weak shadows looked sharper, but were noticeably more jaggy and frankly cheap looking. The strong option here filters them slightly to reduce how noticeable this is, but frankly, it doesn't actually look that much better to my eye. This is where the new strongest option comes into play, which creates shadows that look much softer, which is far more realistic than the pin-sharp shadows we saw previously. Unlike what many early to mid-2000s video games, such as id Software's Doom 3 would have you believe, shadows are not actually tack sharp, so this new option once again makes the game look far more realistic. Now don't get me wrong, I adore how those old stencil shadows looked, though it's perhaps not the best fit for a game with this art direction. Another improvement to shadows is how they become blurrier as they stretch from their origin point, which is a really nice detail that actually took me a while to notice, but now that I have, I really appreciate it. They also tend to cast from more than one source now. For example, watch as my shadow transitions from one light source to another in this footage. They also added a new option, cast shadows, with 3 presets, minimum, normal, and maximum. The game describes it as adjusting the intensity of shadows cast when your character is illuminated, but I'm not entirely sure what this option actually does. I've been in a few situations where this would hypothetically make a difference, and yet none of the options seem to really make any difference. Minimum appears to be the same as maximum. I tried a few scenarios where this option could potentially affect things, but I was unable to see a difference, which greatly confuses me. Not to mention, the research I did online yielded unsatisfactory and uninformative results. Perhaps this option only does something in the Dawntrail areas, but there's no way for me to see for sure. If anyone has an explanation, or if I'm simply downright wrong, please let me know in the comments below. Regardless of this, and regardless of some very questionable problems here and there, the changes made to the graphical options are generally an improvement across the board. While the anti-aliasing options aren't perfect, and the way the game handles upscaling is limiting and bizarre, these inclusions are still welcome as they give the player more customization and are generally solid for their intended purposes. But let's look at some of the more general graphical improvements. The first thing that comes to mind is how the game's materials have been vastly improved. Take the Drowning Wench over in Limsa, for example. The wooden floor in the older engine used to be abnormally reflective, as if Baderon Tenfingers had just gone and mopped the place. Now, the floor's reflections are not only much more subtle, but much more matte instead of glossy, better fitting how wood actually reacts to light. I remember when I first started the game, the wood being so abnormally shiny was actually something I would bitch and moan to a friend of mine. So speaking off the script here, it is a little funny how this did eventually get corrected, essentially showing that my little complaints weren't entirely unfounded. Perhaps most impressively is how much better the skin shaders look, especially on dark-skinned characters. I play a Keeper of the Moon Mikote, and she's very dark-skinned. Previously, in different lighting conditions, characters in general looked rather flat and plasticine, but unfortunately, this disproportionately affected dark-skinned characters. This update remedies this, Just look at my Mikote's skin in direct sunlight in the water. The light from the sun reflects off of her skin in a way that gives her a realistic glow. Notice also how the shaders highlight her collarbones and the creases in her neck. This lends her model far greater depth and makes her look much more like a real person, of course within the game's stylized art style. Notice how her lips now have realistic creases and folds. Moreover, look at how much better hair looks. While it's clearly still a texture on top of a mesh and not individual strands, the materials here look far closer to strands than ever before. And most importantly, the subsurface scattering on her face, a real-life lighting phenomenon in which light penetrates the surface of skin, causing a slight glow, makes her look better than ever. You can now see the individual pores on her face, instead of simply being a flat texture. This applies to every character in the game. Just take a look at Artorial here, and how the light behind him causes the thinner parts of his ears to glow, just like if you put a flashlight behind your finger. This also applies to the creatures found throughout Eorzea. Look at how slimy and gross this Bloodshore Bell looks thanks to its new shaders. While not a shader, volumetric lighting looks so much better and is generally much higher resolution than how they could be somewhat pixelated beforehand. Watch how it pours through the leaves of this palm tree in Costa del Sol. It really is a gorgeous sight. Wet objects in general tend to look a lot better, such as stone pathways in rain. Textures have also been updated for the most part, largely with detail textures placed over their original textures, sort of similar to something like Deus Ex or Unreal, a very strange old-style method that really almost makes the game, for a very brief moment, look like it runs on Unreal Engine 1, though many of the textures have been outright replaced entirely. For example, look at this Aethernet shard. The new texture gives the metal part a distinctively metallic look, whereas previously it could have passed for concrete. Now it almost looks like copper or brass, and looks remarkably high-res for a game of this age. Check out the crystal too, which looks remarkably more, well, crystalline. Grass textures were also entirely replaced. The once dated flat textures have now been replaced with full strands, which billows more realistically in the wind. Unfortunately, the texture upgrades across the board have been sort of a mixed bag. For example, let's take a look at this concrete wall in Limsa. While the details in the darker areas look strikingly realistic, in the lighter areas, it's clearly just some sort of normal map or detailed texture put over an extremely low-res base, or this toy chest in the inn rooms. From a normal playing distance, you'd be hard-pressed to notice any enhancements at all, but zoom in and you'll notice they've upgraded these textures too on top of an extremely low-res base, and it doesn't even apply equally. It's like putting lipstick on a pig, frankly. Not every texture was upgraded either. For example, my Ishtola Rule minion looks as crusty as ever, and in some areas, such as Little Alamigo, these discrepancies are so obvious it feels as if nothing has changed at all. However, I do want to give Square a little bit of credence here. Since this update is a work in progress, I'll let these discrepancies, in a sense, get off with a warning. Context aside though, the inconsistencies do look pretty bad, and I have to evaluate what's in front of my eyes, not necessarily what's promised for the future. However, I do want to focus on what they did change. For example, check out these metal materials in this cave, which gleam from the lighting in a manner that looks far nicer than the flat texture before. I would say that the texture changes that impressed me the most were the alterations to character outfits. As you might hope, the designs themselves are unchanged, but the materials look genuinely fantastic now. Look at the leather on Alphino's Shado's jacket. Even at a normal cutscene distance, it downright pops off the screen, with light reflecting off of it in a way that looks borderline photorealistic. In this instance, it just nearly, looks like a game that came out this year. Most of the other main characters see similar upgrades, which I think is a big improvement. For example, Ishtola looks much better as well. However, player outfits don't really get the same treatment. Many of the outfits the player can wear still look really crusty and pixelated, especially compared to how the main character's outfits have been refined. I do understand that there are quite literally hundreds of outfits in the game, and that it would take a long time to redo every single asset for every single costume, but given the amount of money this game rakes in, I would say that this is something to improve steadily but surely over the coming years. Square also took this opportunity to fix some of the problems plaguing the game before this update. One issue that rather annoyed me about the game before Dawntrail was how the game handled character physics. Essentially, the game's cloth physics were tied to the frame rate in some way or another, and at frame rates above 60 FPS, character physics would break. I've heard reports of it greatly reducing character effects, but in my experience, it actually made them look jagged and unrealistic. For example, take a look at the opening cutscene for Heavensward. The billowing wind of the Ishgardian tundra causes the party's clothes to freak out, flopping about in a way that looks like a glitch, which I suppose isn't too far from the truth. I assume this was never intended behavior. Post-update, this is fixed. You can now see their clothes billowing in a more subtle, realistic way, which makes such an important scene no longer distracting. A similar comparison can be made in Garuda's cutscene in A Realm Reborn, seeing as her boss arena is full of harsh winds. This was something that I was hoping Square would actually eventually fix, and was part of my personal wish list, but I didn't actually have the confidence that they would fix it. I'm genuinely glad to see that I was proven wrong. That being said, some of the older problems still remain. Shadow quality is good overall, but it still exhibits a rather distracting looking flickering problem that I had previously criticized in my Heavensward video. I read some forum posts online that suggested this has to do with the LOD settings, and whether you have it enabled or disabled. However, in my experience, this is still an issue regardless of your settings of choice. While I understand that this is still ultimately a game that is over a decade old, they are still distracting, and I think some sort of improvement in the ways shadows resolve would greatly improve the appearance of cutscenes in particular. They can even bug out in some scenes, such as the final cutscene of the Heavensward patch quests. As we can see, Square's replacement of these assets has been sort of a mixed bag so far. While the graphical improvements are technically still in development, I do think what they actually did end up changing was a bit of a strange introduction to it. I've even noticed some of my less graphically inclined friends say they felt like things hadn't really changed at all, and while that's clearly not true, I can understand why they got that impression when large swaths of the game feel barely touched, and not minor areas either, and I do praise Square for what they have managed to do right with this update. But it's not perfect. There is very clearly room for improvement despite a lot of very welcome changes. Finally, I would like to cap the video off with one last thing: suggestions. There are many things I would like to see Square do with the game now that they've begun significantly overhauling the visuals. The very tip top of my list would be support for high dynamic range monitors. In my opinion, HDR is one of the biggest, most important things for image quality nowadays. I remember playing Bloober Team's Silent Hill 2 remake remake late last year, a shockingly fantastic game, and the way the game looked, from the swirling whites of the fog world to the fiery reds of the other world, James Sunderland's descent into a hell of his own making was definitely improved by its HDR support. These moments leapt off of the screen in ways that they certainly wouldn't have otherwise had I played in SDR. By the way, play the original game, it is one of my favorite games of all time, thanks bye. Final Fantasy XIV is a game with a pretty great lighting system, all things considered, and a wide variety of colorful locations that could easily pop right out of the screen with HDR. Now, I'm not dumb. I do know that there are ways to force it, such as Windows 11's Auto HDR feature, but I would like the game to have official HDR integration, so Square can fine-tune it for their specific game. They've done it before. Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, Final Fantasy XVI, and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth all have native HDR integration. Now, of course, the remake games are running on Unreal Engine 4, which natively supports HDR on an engine level, and I understand that is a bit different than Final Fantasy XIV's dated and proprietary game engine, but I still think that it could add a new dimension to Final Fantasy XIV's great visuals, and something I would highly implore them to add. Likewise, another thing I'd like to see is, of course, adjustments to some of the things I've criticized in this video. The addition of adjustable options for the DLSS and FSR integrations. Using them as glorified dynamic resolution modes is helpful only to a subsect of people. By allowing the user to choose the quality mode they want, you not only appease those who really need those extra frames, but also those who might want a bit of a performance boost without nuking image quality. I would also suggest possibly implementing support for the Intel XeSS upscaler, as some may prefer that. Obviously, I would also like them to continue upgrading the game's texture assets, but that sort of goes without saying, they're gonna do that anyways. Final Fantasy XIV is, at the end of the day, still a multi-platform game from 2013. Developed for 7th gen PC and console hardware, it will never hold a candle in terms of pure fidelity to any of Square Enix's recent output, no matter how much you wish to polish it. I remember initially feeling a little sad in the weeks before the graphics update, knowing that the game's technical and visual identity, which I had grown accustomed to for better or for worse, would no longer be accessible in any official form whatsoever. It does feel strange knowing that the version of the game's presentation where most of my memories lie, even as recently as 2 years ago, is now entirely inaccessible outside of YouTube videos. Of course, this is simply the trajectory of all live service games, especially MMOs, and if you look at something like Bungie's Destiny 2, it could always be far worse. Remember, you could always be Destiny 2, so appreciate that you are not. My difficulty to let go aside, this graphics update, as incomplete as it may be, is very welcome. It does genuinely improve upon the game's many visual flaws and aspects of it that may simply just be dated, such as the rendering of skin, anti-aliasing, ambient occlusion, shadow quality, and texture quality in many instances. That being said, this update still maintains flaws of its own, such as a perplexing upscaling implementation, inconsistent upgraded asset quality, and a general sense that Square could have done quite a bit more than it actually did. Still, on the whole, it's been a positive change, and I remember downloading that initial Dawntrail benchmark and my jaw dropping when I saw my Mikote for the very first time. Perhaps I'll revisit this topic one day, either when I eventually get to Dawntrail or if Square makes further substantial changes to pre-Dawntrail areas. But that's enough about me. What about you? What did you think of the graphics update? Did you appreciate its improvements or bemoan its flaws? Do you even agree with me on what the improvements or flaws are? Please let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, a like and subscribe, as well as sharing the video, does a lot to help the channel. I am dangerously close to 1,000 subscribers, and if I can start making some money off of this, I'll be able to justify putting more time, effort, and perhaps even money and resources into these videos. If you'd like to read some of my essays pertaining to both video games and film, my backlogged and letterboxed accounts will be linked in the description below. Of course, the next video will be the Heavensward Patch Quests video, a long delayed video which I do apologize for, but stay tuned for that.